Welcome to day 202 on the trail. We have four readings for today. From Mark chapter 6, verse 53 through chapter 7, verse 23, 2 Samuel 18, verses 1 through 32, the Song of Solomon, chapter 3, verse 1 through chapter 8, verse 5, and 3 Maccabees chapter 6, verses 1 through 15. We begin today in 2 Samuel. After entering Jerusalem and usurping his father's throne, Absalom decides to ignore the advice of his advisor, Ahithophel, who suggested attacking David and his entourage while they were escaping Jerusalem and still weakened. Instead, Absalom listens to David's friend Hushai, who David planted in the court of Absalom to oppose the advice of Ahithophel. Feeling that his counsel and guidance was no longer wanted by Absalom, Ahithophel returned to his hometown where he hanged himself. Some commentators have attempted to connect the death of Ahithophel to that of Judas Iscariot, since both hung themselves. However, this does not seem to be enough to connect the two in any meaningful way. David crosses the Jordan and establishes a temporary base of operations at Mahanaim. There, David gathers around him a large military unit of thousands and hundreds. As the confrontation with Absalom approaches, the leaders of David's army convince him to stay behind and not to lead the army into battle, despite that being the customary role of a king. However, there's also the possibility that the leaders of the army are concerned that David may pose a risk to his own troops, as we see in David's instructions to his three commanders in 2 Samuel 18, verse 5, which reads, "The king ordered Joab and Abishai and Ittai, saying, 'Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom.' And all the people heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders concerning Absalom." David's concern for Absalom may have placed those faithful to David in harm's way. David's army defeats the Israelites under the leadership of Absalom, and during the battle, this happens. 2 Samuel 18, verse 9. Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak. His head caught fast in the oak, and he was left hanging between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. The traditional view of this part of the story is that Absalom was caught by his hair, which was mentioned earlier in the story. Perhaps the intention is to show that it was Absalom's hair, a source and symbol of his pride, which brought about this humiliating death. Upon finding Absalom, a nameless man informs Joab. Then it appears that Joab may have offered him a bribe to kill Absalom. Verse 11. Joab said to the man who told him, "What? You saw him? Why then did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have been glad to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt." Instead of respecting David's instructions not to harm Absalom, Joab is acting deceitfully. Perhaps Joab senses that David's love for Absalom will continue to be a problem for David and the kingdom if Absalom is allowed to live, so he takes matters into his own hands. Following his death, Absalom was not buried in the usual family grave, but unceremoniously thrown into a pit and covered with stones. A similar fate was given to the defeated king of Ai in Joshua 8, and the defeat of the 5 kings in Joshua 10. Although the actual burial site of Absalom is not specified, we find a note added to the story about a structure Absalom built for himself in the king's valley. Verse 18. Now Absalom, in his lifetime, had taken and set up for himself a pillar that is in the king's valley, for he said, "I have no son to keep my name in remembrance." He called the pillar by his own name. It is called Absalom's monument to this day. The location of this pillar is unknown, although it is sometimes associated with the Kidron Valley. However, this pillar of Absalom mentioned in 2 Samuel 18 should not be confused with the tomb of Absalom, which is standing outside of Jerusalem's Old City today. This structure, shown here, dates from the 1st century AD. For centuries, stones have been hurled at this monument to express the disdain for Absalom's rebellion against his father. Turning to the New Testament and the Gospel of Mark. In chapter 7, we find a dispute between Jesus and the scribes and Pharisees over tradition, specifically eating with defiled hands. Jesus responds to their complaint using Isaiah 29, verse 13, and the prophet's condemnation of worship, which is empty and superficial. From Mark chapter 7, beginning in verse 6, he said to them, Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition. While tradition itself is not bad, tradition that is not accountable to a living and active relationship with God is worthless. Traditions can help us order our lives or structure our worship of God, but they must never replace or interfere with our true, heartfelt relationship with God. Therefore, Jesus moves the cause of defilement from what is external, such as touching or eating, to what is internal, our hearts and minds. Notice that this discussion of external versus internal defilement follows several stories where Jesus dismisses the traditional views of defilement. For example, Jesus touches a leper in chapter 1. He later visits an area where swine are kept, touches a corpse, and is touched by an unclean woman, all in chapter 5. In all of these stories, Jesus dismisses any concern over ritual defilement. Instead, he takes a very different approach. From chapter 7, beginning in verse 18, he said to them, Then do you also fail to understand? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from the outside cannot defile, since it enters, not the heart, but the stomach, and goes out into the sewer? Thus he declared all foods clean. And he said, It is what comes out of a person that defiles. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, and folly. All of these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. For Jesus, it is the heart, a person's inward being, that determines their relationship with God, not the stomach. Therefore, defiled food cannot defile one's heart, and therefore the person. It is the heart that must be protected, not the stomach. For the heart is where all of the evil intentions listed by Jesus arise. As we find in Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23, keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, stay on the trail.